All right. Well, there's a bit of authoritative information from the regular host of this program, Steve Vogel, who turns guest today. They treat you okay downstairs?
Yeah, you know, Don, I've listened to this program for years now, and I'm really looking forward to being your guest.
Well, we're looking forward to it, too, and we've got a reason for that. Steve Vogel has authored a new book called Reasonable Doubt, a true story. Boy, listen to this, what they put on the dust cover here. A true story of lust and murder in the American heartland. Were those your words or somebody else's?
The main title, Reasonable Doubt, is my title. I had something else for a subtitle, which was pretty close to that, but not exactly. Heartland, that's a real hot word right now.
That's right.
In the Midwest, forget the Midwest, that's gone. Heartland is where we live.
Well, so is this whole thing called true crime stories, and we're hearing more about that now, and this is one, of course, with which many people in our listening area are familiar, the Hendricks murder case, which dates back to 1983. The book has just arrived in the bookstores here in Bloomington, Normal, and presumably is arriving in bookstores across the country. And we're going to ask a regular host of this program and now author Steve Vogel about it. Well, it's a little strange seeing you across the counter this afternoon, but let's get on with this thing. I remember the morning when I found out first that there'd been a tragic grouping of murders on the east side of Bloomington. And I don't remember much more than that. I don't remember the date, don't remember the time of the year. What I remember is being awakened early to come in here to do the morning show. Our staff was sort of being mobilized, and I remember when I arrived here that you were on the scene on the east side of Bloomington already, and were telling waking McLean County about some tragic news that had happened overnight. Track us through just for a minute or two. What happened there?
Well, it was kind of a strange thing because it had the bodies were discovered late on election night. So I had been here working, had worked a very long day, and had worked into the late nighttime hours, and really had been in bed a very short time when Jim Brown, who was doing the overnight show, called me out of bed and said, we have this multiple death situation working, and maybe you want to look into it. And actually not too far from where I live, about a mile away. And I had assumed it was probably like a natural gas leak or some type of a natural explanation, maybe a murder-suicide at the worst, and maybe 1-2 people dead, something like that. And I was really pretty horrified to find out that there were 4 people, 3 young children and a mother, who were killed in a murder. And then it was really quite a few hours later that we found out exactly how brutal and terrible the crime was.
And it took a little while to find out who the family was, where the surviving members, or in this case, member of the immediate family was. And the name David Hendricks didn't really enter into the story until a bit further into the day.
Well, that's right. In fact, we had made a conscious decision here in WJBC not to approach him because of the obvious reason. I mean, here's a man who was going through, had quite a loss, and it was not clear that he was any type of a suspect at that point. But we also said to ourselves, if we find out that he's doing any interviews with anybody else, then we will try to talk with him. Turned out that we found out just before 4:30 news on that next afternoon that he indeed had given an interview to both the Panagraph and the Associated Press. So we made a call to his office, and he talked with me live on the air very briefly as part of our 4:30 news that afternoon.
So what had been found was that David Hendricks' 3 young children and his wife were all dead. They'd all been killed in their home on the east side.
In their beds.
In their beds. He was. He had told police that he had been away on a business trip and had left the home somewhere around the midnight hour the night before. Police believed that the murders had occurred sometime during the overnight hours, and they at that point weren't certain whether the time would have been before he left or after he left. But the upshot of it all was, as the investigation continued, Hendricks was charged with the murders some days later, and then the judicial process began to take over. Eventually, the trial was moved to Rockford, where there had not been as much publicity. Hendricks was found guilty after a lengthy trial, which you covered. How many weeks?
It was really just about 9 weeks. And that includes the jury selection, which took quite some time.
And you were there for the whole thing. There was an appeal then to the appellate court, which was turned down. Eventually, an appeal to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, I guess, surprised some people when they agreed to hear the appeal.
That's right. When the appellate court unanimously upheld the conviction on a 3-0 vote, it's rather unusual for the Supreme Court to decide to hear it. They think there's been a trial court already hear it. There's already been a jury involved. There's already been the appellate court. And then for the Supreme Court to accept the case was considered quite unusual. And then they heard the case and then literally did not rule on it for almost 2 years. And when they did, the vote was 4-2 to uphold the verdict.
And now there's been a recent development within the past week where the Supreme Court has now said that they will hear they'll hear an additional, or they'll reopen.
They will reconsider the Hendricks case.
Okay, so it's not a new appeal, but they'll reconsider the Hendricks case.
That's right. They'll look at the evidence once again and all the legal arguments.
And at this point, we don't know why they've decided to do that.
Right, there's no comment on that.
Right. So that's where the thing stands. At what point along this route did you believe that you had a book, that a book was possible out of this, and in fact you were interested in doing a book?
Very early. I had not covered much of the case between the time of the deaths and the trial. Other people in the news department were working on it pretty much. And when the case began to unfold and all these little twists and turns in it and the like became evident during the trial, I started to wonder if this wasn't a story that deserved to be told in some depth. And Charles Merrill Smith, whom you know and many of our listeners know as a member of WJBC's Forum, he was a best-selling author back in the late 60s and then had a series of books that followed his best-selling effort, a series of mystery books. And I called him back here in Bloomington and told him what was on my mind and asked him how I should approach it. And he gave me some advice, and we went from there.
The Upshot is a book that's out now. It's published by, Contemporary Books, right, out of Chicago and New York, and it's priced at $19.95, and it's in the bookstores right now. I want to ask you a few questions about, having just read the book, things that have occurred to me, being a casual observer of all the news stories that came out of the trial and the talk on Problems and Solutions since. And then
they wouldn't be taking him to trial. And it was, then the issues really became twofold, and they remain so as far as I'm concerned. One is whether he, in fact, committed the murders and is truly guilty of it. And then the secondary question is whether he was proved guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And you'll get people who feel strongly on either side of that issue.
I guess my impression from reading your book is that you are still undecided in your own mind about his own guilt, but maybe have a little stronger feeling that, although not 100% feeling, maybe a little stronger feeling that he was not proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt.
Well, it's really personal with me. I believe, and of course it's hard to put yourself in the jury box totally, but I believe that if I had served in the jury, I would not have been able to vote for guilt. Things change once you are a juror. They're a lot different, I suspect, than being an observer from the other side of the rail in the courtroom. But the standards, it was a completely circumstantial case. There's no physical evidence at all against David Hendricks. And the standards for voting guilty are quite a bit different in a case like that, and the jury was instructed that way. Basically, it is that you have to be able to rule out every other conceivable scenario as to how the crime could have occurred before you can find someone guilty based on circumstantial evidence. And that was a standard the jury accepted and apparently was able to deal with, and when it, after a number of hours of deliberation, decided he was guilty.
And because it was a case built on circumstantial evidence, I think it's almost natural that a lot of emotion's going to enter into the thing. There, character and that kind of thing, and that's where the whole scenario of the parade of witnesses, the models about who modeled the back brace as part of his business, and that's where the sex comes into the story to the extent it did. It's not a heavy part of the story, but that's where it came in. The defense counsel, at the conclusion of the thing, said that in essence, said that David Hendricks was convicted by theater, not by evidence, even circumstantial evidence. That that the whole thing was a show, and that I think the implication is that the jury was swayed by emotion and not by evidence. You think that makes sense?
Well, that was Hal Jennings' closing argument, and I don't know. I did not get the impression from the jurors that I talked with that was an overriding issue. It may have swayed them unconsciously, subconsciously, more than I believe it did. But there's no doubt about it, just in terms of showing that David Hendricks had another side, one not known to his friends and family, hurt him in the jurors' minds.
I want to open the whole thing up to, I've got some other questions, but I want to open things up to the listeners here, and we'll do that. We'll not wait till after the news. We'll do it right now at 829-2345 or 1-800-322-9377. I'll ask you a couple of other questions as we go along as well, but you can give us a call right now. Our guest is Steve Vogel, author of the new book called Reasonable Doubt, here on Problems and Solutions. Let's get to the telephone lines here on Problems and Solutions. Steve Vogel is our guest, and you're on the air. Go ahead.
Okay, I have a question for Steve. First of all, I spent the last 2 nights up reading the book so I could get it done before you'd be on the show.
Oh, good.
And I, for one, was never convinced either way. It was convenient for me to believe that David Hendricks was guilty. It was easy for me to say, oh, there was a connection, rather than think it could happen at random, because then you're fearful that it would happen to you. Mm-hmm. But reading the book, I was real interested in all the excerpts from the trial. I thought that was done real well. But a couple of things came to mind. One was on page 63, you talk about Claude Miller and Bud Metzler's questioning that, I assume in that paragraph you're talking about that they thought the deaths occurred later than the prosecution.
Yeah, they were the two people who dealt with the bodies, and by the time they received them, of course, the bodies had been autopsied and all that, and they believed, in essence, that the state of the bodies indicated them that the murders had to occur quite a bit later than the prosecution theorized, which, of course, speaks to whether Hendricks could have been present at the time.
Right, and unless I missed it, I didn't see them called as a witness for the defense.
Right. They were not called as witnesses by the defense. The defense did not know about their feelings. In fact, that's one of the things that I think the family members will be interested to learn when they read the book.
Oh, okay. And the other thing I was wondering that came to mind, if in fact Hendricks did kill it, and one of the questions was the time. If they didn't get home till 8:15, how could the kids been asleep by 9 and been killed? Mm-hmm. One thing that came to mind for me, and they didn't mention in the autopsy, and I'm sure they looked for everything, but was some type of like ether or something, how they would be or be put asleep. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
And the same with the mother, that they said her clothes were piled haphazardly. That would account for that. But
you're suggesting that there may have been some type of thing that put them asleep and then he murdered them.
Right, something like that.
The toxicology tests were run on their blood samples, and as far as I know, there was nothing that indicated there was any type of thing like that in their system.
Okay, well, those were 2 questions that came to mind. It's a very interesting book, and having lived close to the area at the time, it brought back lots of memories.
Yeah.
Thanks for the call, ma'am. Steve, what kind of cooperation or roadblocks did you have from David Hendricks and from his family?
Hendricks tried to stop me from writing the book at the beginning. When it became clear that he had no grounds to do that, then he had second thoughts, and really it was kind of a revelation overall from him. He believes that he probably lost a few points in the public's eye by not talking to the media early on, which was the advice of his counsel. He basically kept his, after that initial foray in which he didn't come off so good, he basically remained silent, and in the meantime, the police and prosecution were talking rather freely with reporters and got their side out.
Problems and Solutions, you're on the air with Steve. Go ahead.
My question sort of ties in with that. I wondered if any of the profits from the book, any proceeds will tie in, that go to a defense fund or that go to David Hendricks.
Well, there's no plan for that at this time.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Steve, let me speak to that just a little bit. My impression when I first knew you were going to do the book is that you approached this as not as a crusader or not as an advocate, but much the way you approach doing this show with controversial subjects, and that is that you had your reporter's hat on.
Well, that's exactly right, and it really was kind of a painful process for me to accept the idea. In fact, I lost quite a bit of sleep over it, of the idea that I felt after having written, 416 pages plus pictures in the book, 408 pages are simply retelling the story as objectively as I can, and then there's an 8-page epilogue where I take off my reporter's hat, as you wrote, and try to analyze the case and put in a few more facts that may not be readily apparent as people read the book about the pros and cons on guilt and innocence and all that. It was pretty painful for me to realize that I was going to have to express an honest opinion that there's some doubt that this man is guilty, and of course that's not an opinion held by people I have reported about and been friends with, some of them, for quite a few years.
Problems and Solutions, and you're on the air with Steve. Go ahead.
Steve, two things. I'll hang up and listen. I heard that some of the jurors, the trial was so long, they'd actually nod off and go to sleep. And my second thing was, a person, I won't name the person because they're not there to defend themselves, but they are very high in the investigation of the crime, said that there was a lot of things that proved him guilty, but that was not brought up in the trial, and I couldn't understand that. Could you go into that?
Yeah, the last thing first, I am not aware of anything that points the finger at guilt at David Hendricks that was not brought up at the trial. I mean, they were desperate to find some physical evidence against him that would tie him to these terrible crimes, and they could find none. And for the people who've read the book, they know about sewers being searched and the house virtually dismantled and all those things. I am certain that if there was anything else that showed Hendricks guilty, that number one, they would have tried to get it admitted as evidence, and of course those are all public hearings outside the juror's presence. They did not do that. And number two, I think I would have heard about it by now. Number two, about the sleeping jurors, I saw two instances of people nodding off. One was one person during the trial, very briefly, and then there was actually one juror who nodded briefly during the closing arguments.
I'll be darned. I want to ask you about, thanks for the call, ma'am. I want to ask you about the prosecution, how the prosecution team felt about this whole thing. We'll do that when we come back after the news, and we'll entertain some more phone calls here on Problems and Solutions at 829-2345 or 1-800-322-9377. Our guest is Steve Vogel. We've turned the tables. Steve's new book is just out in the bookstores called Reasonable Doubt, the story of the Hendricks murders in our community back in 1983, the subsequent trial, and the process that's gone on since then. Steve, one of the toughest jobs when this happens, in addition to the job of the police who discovered all of this, and you describe how all of that transpired on the night of the murders, or on the later night. I guess it was before midnight when it was after midnight.
No, it was about 10:30 when the bodies were discovered.
Of the next day. The real burden falls on the chief prosecutor, the state's attorney. Judge Ron Dozier was state's attorney of McLean County at that point. And my impression from reading the book, and I guess it's more than an impression because I think you say so rather directly, is that Dozier was not convinced of Hendricks' guilt each day that went along. I mean, he vacillated a bit, more than a bit.
He did, but I think he believes that the evidence compounded itself, and he felt better and better about the case. But then, literally on the eve of the trial, he and Hendricks had a face-to-face meeting in the detective's office at the Law and Justice Center. Hendricks had already been in jail for something like 10 or 11 months by that time. And it was to be a completely off-the-record conversation between the two men where nothing could be used in the trial and the like. And, of course, I retell about this conversation in some detail. But basically, Dozier went into that meeting to try to get Hendricks to cop a plea. You admit, the basic message was, you admit that you committed the crimes. I think I understand why you did it. I think I can sell the community on the idea of why you did it and that you don't deserve the death penalty. I will commit to you now, if you will admit to the crimes, confess to the crimes, we will not seek the death penalty. And when Dozier left that hour-long meeting, he felt at that moment that he had the wrong man. He was unconvinced that Hendricks was a killer, and he had a sleepless night.
There was, but the trial went on, and there was a point at which Dozier was reasonably certain again that he had the right man, and then there was a point where he really felt it sort of locked in his mind.
That's right, and I believe that was after Hendricks testified.
Yeah. Let's get back to the telephone lines here. Some people have been waiting during the course of the newscast here on Problems and Solutions to talk with Steve, and you're on the air. Go ahead, ma'am.
Hello. I just wanted to have my say about Mr. Hendricks. One of the things we thought was a little bit strange was when he showed up at his appointments and the people were not, waiting. They did not know that he was on their way to, have an appointment with them. And also, I spoke with one of the newscasters, I don't want to say who, over in Peoria, and he was very shocked that Dave Hendricks showed no emotion at all. He absolutely could not believe it. Now, the clincher that I have is my son was in Menard with Dave Hendricks, and he got pretty close with Dave, and Dave was laughing about it and things, and he admitted to my son that he did kill his family. And when my son came back from Menard, he told some of the higher-ups, and they backed away out of it, and they said that they were very glad that he had come and told them that they wanted nothing to do with it.
Well, that's interesting. Let me comment on a couple things about this. The appointments, I think you make a pretty good point about that, although it's also true that, particularly in that business, salesmen frequently make what they call cold calls. I mean, you don't have an appointment, you just stop into a business, you hope to meet the person. In this case, Hendricks was trying to let people know, number one, they could order his new back brace directly from him and cut out the middleman and make a bigger profit for him as well. And number two, that he was coming out with a new version of the brace. So it was not, and there was some testimony to this extent, that cold calls by salesmen in this business were not terribly unusual, and he had done it before. The emotion, that is a very important part of the trial. The fact that he did not show much emotion, particularly in the television interviews that occurred the afternoon after the bodies were discovered. They were shown to the jurors, and I think that was important to the jurors.
Thanks for the call, ma'am. I appreciate the call.
Let me also respond to the talking to her son, the inmate. Anything's possible. That does not sound very likely because Hendricks, if he's standing up and is saying he's innocent to everybody, including his family and everybody else, I'm not sure why he would ever tell a fellow inmate something like that.
One of the interesting things to me was it seems to me that nobody in Hendricks' family, nobody in his wife's family, and nobody who knew him well, people, close business associates and associates in his religious organization, nobody, at least according to the book, seems to believe that he's guilty.
That's right. That's one of the ironies. I mean, they knew him best, and that's something that weighed on the jurors' minds. I mean, they saw nothing but a loving family. In fact, some family members were literally jealous of how close Susan and David Hendricks seemed to be, and the love for the children. So that's what made it so much more difficult to understand.
Let's take another phone call. You're on the air. Go ahead.
Yes. When a person tells a lie, that's self-evidence, and you prove him in a lie. And David Hendricks said that the victims were alive when he left at near 12 o'clock, and they had eaten at 6 o'clock that night, and the children, the food in the children's in their digestive system hadn't digested at all. They were killed shortly after they had eaten.
Right.
And it shows that he lied about leaving at near 12 o'clock because he said they were alive, and they weren't alive. They were proven not alive at that time. That's evidence, and you can't strike it out. And it takes takes a long time for food to digest, but it's pretty well digested in 6 hours. But I wanted to make I think that David Hendricks was guilty and he should have been hung. But I wanted to draw attention to the fact that Truman Capote, he was a novelist. He wrote a criminal case up into a book that was a very bestseller. So maybe we're going to get a bestseller out of that.
Well, I doubt it. In Cold Blood was really a classic and unusual book at the time. I don't think so, this matches that.
It's just about the awfulest thing I ever heard of.
Well,
and I think that maybe the people that are studying criminal cases like that might buy the book for their collection, you know.
Well, they may. The interesting thing to me, Don, is that Michael Bodden, who was once the New York City's chief medical examiner, the equivalent of coroner, was one of the heavy-duty witnesses in this case. He has just written a book about forensic medicine. It's not a scientific book. It's a popular book in which he spends several pages on the Hendricks case.
Well, but to get to the allegation that the lady made, the principal thing she said, that it was proven that the family died before he left the house. That may be in the minds of the jurors. I mean, that may be why they convicted him.
Very important evidence.
But it is true that some expert testimony testified that you can't prove that.
That's right. That was a prime contention in the case, whether or not you can specifically tell within a narrow range what time a person dies based upon what the contents of their stomachs look like when you know what time they ate. We know what time the kids had their pizza, and they thought they could tell that they died within a couple of hour range earlier than David Hendricks said he left home. On the other side of the argument is the fact that we also know that Susan Hendricks ate some harder-to-digest things like raw cauliflower and carrots and the like at about 9:15 at night at a baby shower, and there wasn't a trace of food in her stomach.
Thanks for the call, ma'am. Steve, is this, for somebody who hasn't read this book, I know the answer to this, but is this a rather strong case that built that David Hendricks didn't do it? Is this a free David Hendricks book?
No, it definitely is not. I am not convinced he's innocent. I am neither convinced he's guilty. I tend to lean toward the idea at this moment that he may be innocent. And that's when I put everything I know about the case in a shaker, and it comes out. And part of that, something we haven't talked about, is that there are some other crimes that occurred roughly the same time, which has some striking similarities to the Hendricks killings, and so I don't rule out the possibility there's some connection between them.
You'd mentioned, I think, one out west somewhere in Colorado, and one or two in the state of Indiana?
One in Indiana. These are all multiple murders, just like the Hendricks. They were all situations where the families were killed as they slept. They were all young families. They were all in upper middle-class neighborhoods, all along interstate highways. And
no physical evidence?
No physical evidence in any of them. And the most strikingly similar case occurred in Aurora, Colorado, not too far from Denver, where there were some other very striking similarities to the Hendricks case. Problems and Solutions. Here's a gentleman who I hope has been waiting. Sorry to keep you waiting, sir. You're on the air. Go ahead.
Yes, this is... Hello?
Yes.
This is Mac. Emmanuel, hello? Can you hear me?
Go ahead.
Yes.
Yes, all right, listen. All right, now I was in jail with David Hendricks, okay?
Yeah.
I was on the food card, and I served him every day. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, okay? And
you were one of the jail trustees?
Yes.
Okay.
No, I wasn't a trustee. I was just in there for a petty situation.
Okay, but you worked in the kitchen and talked to him. Okay.
And he had visitors there.
Yeah.
And they also were talking about To a Better World. He has people there. Listen, what I'm trying to say is this. Human nature. I was in the Steve Vogel. If he was there, he'll remember me. And me and him went to the Vietnam Best Parade together. I was Vietnam, okay? Now, and I'm pretty sure that the bottom line is this. If you think you're looking good, you're looking bad. If you're looking bad, you're looking good. What I want to know is this. They call us baby killers.
Having read it, so I hope you'll be on again in a few months when more people have a chance to read it. And second, do you think there will be, if David Hendricks was not a man of means and able to gather all those people to testify in his behalf, there'll be much doubt about his guilt?
That is a good question, and I think about Certainly his defense was expensive. One of the attorneys went to England for a while to research scientific evidence about stomach contents and also look into the background of the Plymouth Brethren, which became an issue. And there were some top-rated forensic scientists from Florida and Texas who came in to investigate and then testify. So it was expensive. So I don't know. Let's say that he was a person who could prove that he should have received a public defender. Whether the public coffers would have been able to finance that type of defense, I doubt it. I think that's just the way our system works.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks for the call. You're on Problems and Solutions. Whoops. You're on Problems and Solutions. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wondered if the bodies that were in the bed were covered with electric blankets. We've heard this.
Yeah, no, it's not true.
Okay, I thought maybe that would be a good alibi there to turn the body or leave the.
Yeah, that was one of the rumors at the time. There were other rumors about it appearing to be some cult type activity and all that, and none of those things was true. At least if there was an electric blanket involved, it was not turned on. I know that for sure.
Okay.
Thanks for the call, sir. You're on Problems and Solutions. Hello.
Yes, I would like to ask Steve how he feels about David Hendricks' recent marriage. I really feel that he knew her before.
Well, I don't know of any evidence that is true. I've not heard that suggestion before either. I'm greatly surprised by his marriage, of course. When I first learned that there was a woman who was interested in marrying him, quite frankly, I thought that she would be a real loser, someone who could not attract anybody else, who desperately wanted someone to call her own and all that. And I found out that Pat Hendricks is a pretty sharp young woman, fairly attractive, very bubbly, extremely energetic, and very bright. And she's not what I would have thought of as a person who wanted to marry someone who could very well, and in all likelihood, will spend the rest of his life in prison.
Has she been married before?
Yes, she is married and divorced. She has 3 children, 2 of whom are pretty young. In fact, a picture of Hendricks, his new wife, and her 2 youngest children shortly after they were married inside the prison walls the day before the Supreme Court decision was announced is in the book.
Okay, well, it's a puzzle.
Sure is.
Thanks for the call, ma'am. When were they married, Steve?
They were married, I think it was December 22nd of last year, and that was really a strange thing to me, because they first had been refused permission to marry, then they received permission about November 1st of last year. Then it was announced that the Supreme Court was going to announce its ruling in the Hendricks case after these many months on about December 22nd or 23rd, and they had set their marriage date as the day before that, and they still went ahead with the marriage. I think if I'd have been her, I would have said, why don't we just wait a few days?
Let's wait another couple days.
That's right, but they got married the day before the decision came down.
Problems and Solutions. Hello.
Yes, I'd like to know if Steve talked to any of the jurors in the case and if any of them expressed later doubts about the ruling.
I have talked to quite a few of the jurors, and none of them expressed any doubts.
Problems and Solutions. You're on the air. Go ahead.
I'd like to talk to Steve.
I'm right here.
I haven't read your book yet. Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
I haven't read your book yet. I went and bought it today.
Okay.
But I just believe he is guilty.
Mm-hmm.
I believe he just outgrew his little plain wife.
Well, that's basically, in a few very short and good words, that is essentially what the prosecution claimed, and that may very well be true. I'm glad you got the book so you can read it and see if your opinion changes in any way.
Oh, okay.
Thanks for the call. Let's take another call before we run out of time. You're on Problems and Solutions. Whoops. We'll take one on this line. You're on the air. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd just like to ask Steve. He was talking about the similar cases in Indiana and out west.
Yes.
If there had been any arrests.
Yes. In the case that's most similar in Colorado, there have never been any arrests, and those murders occurred in January of '84, 2 months after the Hendricks case. In the case of Indiana, there was an arrest 4 or 5 months after the killings in Fort Wayne. Very controversial arrest, which really the controversy almost ended when the young man that they arrested hanged himself in the city jail and left behind a note saying that he had not committed any murders. In California, the California case, there was an arrest of a man who escaped from a medium security prison shortly before the killings, and that is a very controversial case as well. He was convicted on a completely circumstantial case. He is on death row in California, and what is extremely controversial about that case, one of the children was left for dead, having had his throat slashed, and And he had told police that there were 2 men involved in the assailants in the attacks, and they were either white or Hispanic. The person who is on death row in California in connection with this case is a black man.
Okay, and also one other thing, the photos that you have in your book, are there any crime scene photos in there?
No, none.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for the call. So, having said all of this that we've said today, and considering the title of the book, Reasonable Doubt, the fact remains David Hendricks has been convicted by a jury of his peers of the murders of his 3 children and his wife. His case has been heard by the appellate court and has been rejected or turned back. The Supreme Court of the state of Illinois has done the same thing. Now, the Supreme Court has agreed to hear the case one more time. What will it take for David Hendricks to ever in his lifetime become a free man?
Well, the court, of course, could order a new trial, and it would be extremely difficult for the prosecution to piece this case together again. Number one, the court could simply free him based upon the evidence. I think that's pretty unlikely. The other possibility is, of course, some new evidence comes forth, or someone admits to the crime, and there's a good reason to believe them, and that type of thing, and that of course is always possible as well. If he is indeed guilty and he doesn't get a new trial, he's a minority for the rest of his life.
The Hendricks family has put up rather substantial rewards for information as they've, after the whole court case finished, as they've begun to conduct their own investigation, searching for more evidence. Do you have any reason to believe that they have in their possession or presented to the Supreme Court evidence that would cause the Supreme Court to say, let's look at this again?
They may have.
Well, that's an equivocation. We're out of time here. You're going to take some vacation time now next week, Steve, but you'll be on the show on Monday, right?
I'll be on the show Monday, and then I'm going to be gone for about 10 days.
Okay. Thanks for being here. I appreciate that.